The morning of December 7th, 1941, was supposed to be peaceful. Across the Hawaiian Islands, the sun rose over calm waters, and the crews of the U.S. Pacific Fleet went about their Sunday routines. But within minutes, that calm would be shattered by roaring engines, raining bombs, and black smoke spiraling toward the sky. Pearl Harbor was under attack. The Japanese Navy had struck without warning, crippling battleships, destroying planes, and killing thousands. The heart of America's naval power was burning, but fate had spared one ship, the USS Enterprise. She wasn't in port that morning. She was out at sea, delivering aircraft to Wake Island. And that single twist of fate would change everything. As word of the attack reached the Enterprise, her captain, Vice Admiral William Halsey, was furious. His message to the crew was simple: when this war is over, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell. Those words echoed through the ship, and the men of the Enterprise knew their mission had changed forever. They were no longer just sailors, they were avengers. In the weeks that followed, the Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor, navigating through floating wreckage and oil-slicked waters. The sailors stared in silence as they passed the smoldering hulls of the Arizona and the Oklahoma. It wasn't just metal that sank that day. It was pride. It was peace. It was the illusion that America was untouchable. The Enterprise anchored near Ford Island, and for a moment the crew stood on deck, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the horizon. Halsey spoke quietly, but every man could hear the weight in his voice. "We're going to hit them back. Hard." The Enterprise became the tip of America's spear in the Pacific. In the dark months that followed, when the U.S. Navy was still reeling, she was the one ship ready to fight. Her planes struck first at the Marshall Islands, the Gilbert Islands, and Wake, each mission carrying the message that the U.S. wasn't broken, only angry. Japanese propaganda had called America weak, but every bomb dropped from the Enterprise proved otherwise. Still, the ocean was vast, and the enemy was confident. Japanese carriers ruled the seas with precision and pride, their pilots boasting of invincibility. The Enterprise would soon challenge that belief. In April 1942, she escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a daring mission led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, their target, Tokyo itself. No one believed it could be done. The bombers were never meant to take off from a carrier, but desperate times called for impossible courage. As the Enterprise steamed through rough waters, the tension was electric. Every man aboard knew this mission was more than military strategy. It was revenge. The Japanese had brought war to American soil, and now America would return the favor. When the first bomber roared down the deck of the USS Hornet, the Enterprise's partner in the operation, sailors cheered, knowing history was being written in that moment. Hours later, explosions rippled across Tokyo. Though the physical damage was limited, the psychological impact was immense. Japan had been untouchable, or so they thought. But now American bombs had fallen on their capital, and the Enterprise had been there, the guardian that brought the raiders home. The world began to whisper her name. The Japanese called her the Gray Ghost because she always seemed to vanish after every battle, only to return, angrier than before. By mid-1942, the war in the Pacific reached a turning point, the Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese carriers steamed toward the atoll, confident they would crush the remaining U.S. fleet. But thanks to American codebreakers and a desperate sense of determination, the Enterprise was ready. Her air group, led by young, untested pilots, prepared to face a fleet far superior in number and experience. The morning of June 4, 1942, was calm, eerily calm. As the Enterprise launched her aircraft, the sky filled with engines screaming toward destiny. Below deck, sailors worked in near silence, passing bombs hand to hand, refueling planes, and praying quietly. Above them, the battle for the Pacific was about to ignite. The first wave of American torpedo bombers never made it back. They flew into a storm of Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire, falling one by one into the ocean. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. They had drawn the enemy down to sea level, leaving the skies open. At that moment, the Enterprise's dive bombers arrived. They came in from the sun, unnoticed until it was too late. In minutes, they found their marks. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, 3 of Japan's proudest carriers engulfed in flames. The sky turned black with smoke, and the sea boiled with burning fuel. The Japanese fleet was shattered. Midway was not just a victory, it was a statement that the United States Navy, bloodied but unbroken, had turned the tide of the war. When the Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor after Midway, her deck was lined with battle-scarred planes, and her crew carried the weight of history. News of the victory swept across America like wildfire. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, there was hope. And that hope had a name: Enterprise. She had avenged the fallen and restored faith to a wounded nation. But her war was far from over. The Pacific still burned, and new battles waited beyond the horizon. As night fell over the harbor, the Enterprise sat in silence, her hull scarred, her guns silent, her decks stained with oil and salt. Below decks, men slept beside ammunition, engines hummed like a heartbeat, and the smell of war clung to every inch of steel. In the officers' quarters, Halsey wrote a short note in his log. Enterprise stands alone, but she stands strong. Those words would soon become legend, because in the months ahead, she would face storms, bombings, and near destruction. But every time the Japanese thought they had sunk her, she came back, like a ghost that refused to die. The USS Enterprise wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a symbol of vengeance, of resilience, of America's unyielding will to fight back, no matter the odds. And as the Pacific campaign grew darker and bloodier, one truth would become clear to both friend and foe alike. Wherever the Enterprise sailed, victory followed. The ocean had a strange silence after the smoke of Pearl Harbor. Every sailor on the Enterprise carried that silence like a wound. They weren't just fighting for orders now. They were fighting for every man who never made it off Battleship Row. As the Enterprise sailed toward the Pacific's open waters, her decks trembled not with fear, but with purpose. Her first mission was clear: strike back. America needed a victory, something to prove that the Pacific wasn't lost. The crew worked in silence, each one hardened by the faces of friends buried under black water. The Enterprise's flight deck became a symbol of vengeance and redemption. Planes lined up under the rising sun, the engines growling with the hunger of a nation that refused to surrender. Their first target was the Marshall Islands, Japan's fortified outpost deep in the Pacific. The plan was daring. Enterprise would launch a surprise attack, testing the limits of what one carrier could do alone. Before dawn, pilots strapped in, their hands trembling not from fear, but from memory. Commander Wade McCluskey looked at his men and said quietly, "Let's remind them who we are." Then the deck roared to life. One after another, the dauntless bombers thundered into the air, slicing through the morning clouds toward the enemy. The Japanese didn't expect an American counterattack so soon. When Enterprise's planes fell upon their ships, chaos erupted. Bombs screamed down from the sky, tearing through decks and fuel tanks. Explosions ripped through the lagoon, smoke coiling into the heavens. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese sailors looked up and saw the stars and stripes reflected in the flames. But vengeance came at a cost. Not every plane returned. When the surviving pilots landed back on deck, the crew counted the empty spaces. The sea had claimed some of their own. Yet among the grief, there was pride. They had struck back.
They had shown the world that America could still fight and win. News of the raid spread across the fleet like wildfire. The Enterprise had drawn first blood. To the men aboard her, she wasn't just a ship anymore. She was an avenger. The Navy brass began calling her the Gray Ghost, a carrier that struck from nowhere and disappeared into the mist. To the Japanese, she became a name spoken with fear. But this was only the beginning. The Pacific was vast and unforgiving. The Japanese Navy was still powerful, and the war was about to escalate into something beyond imagination. The Enterprise would soon find herself at the center of it all. In May 1942, orders came through for what would become one of the most important naval battles in history, the Battle of Midway. Intelligence had cracked Japanese codes, revealing an ambush aimed at finishing off the U.S. fleet. But this time, America was ready, and the Enterprise was right in the middle of it. On the morning of June 4th, Enterprise's flight deck buzzed with tension. Pilots stood by their planes, listening to the rumble of engines, waiting for the order to launch. The air smelled of oil, salt, and fear. Over the intercom came the words that would change everything. "Pilots, man your planes." Within minutes, the sky was filled with the roar of propellers. The Japanese carriers loomed somewhere beyond the horizon. Finding them was like hunting shadows across a moving sea. Enterprise's dive bombers spread out, searching. Then just before noon, one of the scouts spotted the enemy. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lined up like a floating fortress. The message crackled through the radio. Enemy fleet sighted. McCluskey's squadron dove out of the clouds. The sun was behind them, blinding the Japanese lookouts. The first bomb struck the carrier Kaga dead center, setting off a chain of explosions. Flames shot skyward as Enterprise's pilots screamed into their radios, calling targets and dodging gunfire. The ocean became a battlefield of smoke and fire. By the time it was over, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. The 4th would fall soon after. The Battle of Midway was a turning point, a miracle carved out of courage, timing, and sacrifice. When the Enterprise's bombers returned, their decks were stained with oil and blood, but their hearts were alive with victory. On that day, the course of the war changed. The Japanese advance was halted, and America had found its strength again. The Enterprise had been there through it all, her planes delivering the blows that broke Japan's momentum. Her crew didn't cheer wildly. They just stood on the deck, watching the sunset over the ocean, knowing what it had cost. That night, as the ship drifted under the stars, the sailors gathered quietly. Some wrote letters home, others just stared into the dark horizon. They knew the war wasn't over, it was only beginning, but they also knew one thing. The Enterprise had become something far greater than steel and engines. She was a living spirit, a symbol of defiance. Every man aboard her carried that pride like armor. From that day forward, every time her name appeared on Japanese intercepts, it carried a warning. The Americans are coming.
The months after Midway were supposed to bring relief, but for the crew of the Enterprise, the war was only getting darker. The Pacific stretched out endlessly, and every island, every reef, every cloud on the horizon could hide an enemy. The Enterprise was the only surviving carrier from the early battles still standing. She had become the beating heart of the Pacific Fleet, the ship everyone depended on, and the one the enemy most wanted to destroy. The summer of 1942 brought the next great test, Guadalcanal. The first major American offensive in the Pacific, a jungle island crawling with Japanese troops and surrounded by hostile waters. The Enterprise was ordered to provide air cover for the Marines fighting to hold the island. Day after day, her planes launched into blistering tropical skies, fighting off waves of Japanese bombers and torpedo planes. The crew barely slept. They worked around the clock, refueling, rearming, patching holes in the deck from shrapnel. The smell of fuel and sweat clung to everything. Pilots came back from missions with 1,000-yard stares, their hands shaking as they climbed out of their cockpits. They were fighting not just for survival, but to keep that fragile toehold on Guadalcanal alive. On August 24, 1942, the Enterprise faced her greatest test yet, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The Japanese fleet was coming, and their planes filled the sky like a swarm of hornets. The Enterprise launched every fighter she had, her deck a blur of motion. The first wave hit hard. Bombs fell around the ship, explosions rocking her hull. One found its mark, tearing through the flight deck and sending flames high into the air. For a moment, it looked like the Enterprise would finally fall. Fire crews fought through choking smoke, sailors dragging the wounded away from burning wreckage. The air filled with screams, alarms, and the roar of engines still trying to get off the deck. But somehow, through sheer determination, they held the line. Damage control teams sealed the fires, patched the holes, and within hours, planes were launching again. When the smoke cleared, the Japanese fleet was retreating. The Enterprise was still afloat, battered but alive. Her sailors called her the Lucky E. The name stuck, but luck had nothing to do with it. It was the courage and skill of her crew that kept her alive through storms of steel and fire. Weeks later, she returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs. As she sailed into port, other ships lined the harbor, their crews cheering. To them, the Enterprise was a legend, scarred, scorched, but unbroken. She had taken the fight back to the enemy and survived where others hadn't. In those days, she was more than just a ship. She was America's answer to Pearl Harbor. But there was no rest. As soon as repairs were complete, she was back at sea. The Japanese were preparing for another strike, this time near the Santa Cruz Islands. The Enterprise, still carrying her battle wounds, was ordered to intercept them. On August 26, 1942, the two fleets met in one of the most brutal carrier battles of the war. The Enterprise launched her planes at dawn, the ocean below them glistening with false calm. By mid-morning, Japanese dive bombers were closing in. The first bombs missed. The second didn't. A massive explosion tore through the aft section and sending sailors sprawling across the deck. Alarms blared and black smoke poured into the sky. But even as the fires raged, the Enterprise kept launching planes. Her crew refused to give up. For hours she was under siege. The ship shook from repeated hits, the deck slick with oil and blood. One sailor later said it felt like the ocean itself wanted her dead. But she didn't die. The Enterprise survived again, scarred, bleeding, but alive. When night fell, the sky above the Pacific glowed faintly with the fires of burning ships. The Japanese withdrew. The Enterprise was the only operational carrier left in the entire Pacific theater. She had faced overwhelming odds and refused to sink. To the men of the Navy, she was no longer just the Lucky E. She had become a ghost, a phantom of vengeance that no bomb could destroy. The Japanese began to call her the Gray Ghost, because every time they thought they'd sunk her, she came back. Their pilots would report her destruction only to encounter her again days later, launching fresh squadrons. To them, the Enterprise had become something supernatural, a ship that simply wouldn't die. For the men who served aboard her, that legend came at a price. Each victory meant more empty bunks, more folded flags sent home. They learned to live with loss, to fight through exhaustion and fear. They didn't talk much about courage. They just did their jobs. By the end of 1942, the Enterprise had fought in every major battle of the Pacific.
She had taken hits that should have sunk her, faced fleets that outnumbered her, and still she was there, fighting, launching, surviving. That Christmas, somewhere in the dark waters of the South Pacific, the crew gathered on deck. There were no decorations, no carols, no celebration, just a few quiet men staring at the stars, knowing that they were still alive when so many others weren't. They didn't know what battles lay ahead, but they knew one thing for certain. As long as the Enterprise sailed, America's hope sailed with her. And in Tokyo, deep within the Imperial Navy's command center, an admiral placed his hand on a report that chilled him to the bone. The headline read, USS Enterprise operational again. The ghost of Pearl Harbor was still out there, and she was coming for them.
The dawn of 1943 brought no relief, only more missions, more battles, and the ever-present knowledge that the Japanese were still hunting them. The Enterprise had become the backbone of America's Pacific campaign, but that honor carried a heavy burden. Her sailors were exhausted, their nerves stretched thin. Yet they remained committed to a mission bigger than themselves, to strike back, to keep the enemy off balance, and to ensure that no one ever again underestimated the American Navy. The Battle of Santa Cruz, the ongoing Guadalcanal campaign, and countless smaller skirmishes tested the Enterprise in every conceivable way. Every time her deck shook with explosions, every time a plane fell into the ocean below, the ship's crew fought to maintain order, to patch her wounds, to keep the launch and recovery cycles going. Pilots climbed back into cockpits covered in sweat, blood, and soot, knowing that the survival of the Marines on Guadalcanal often depended on their missions. Every flight was a gamble. Every sortie carried the risk of death. Yet they continued to fly, driven by duty and the unspoken understanding that failure was not an option. The Japanese had begun to learn the truth about the Enterprise. Reports from captured pilots, intelligence intercepts, and survivor accounts all told the same story. This was not just a ship, it was a phantom, a vessel that survived what should have destroyed it. Their repeated attacks failed to sink her, and each failure only strengthened American morale. For every loss, the Enterprise seemed to answer with resilience, her deck crew patching damage with a determination bordering on obsession, ensuring that the ship could sail again and again. October 1943 saw the Enterprise engaged in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign. Her air groups launched devastating raids, crippling Japanese installations and sinking enemy ships with precision. Her presence alone changed the dynamics of battle. The Japanese learned that engaging without considering her air power was suicide. Every mission told a story of courage, strategy, and sheer willpower. Crew members would later recount moments when the odds seemed insurmountable. Bombs raining down, torpedoes slicing through the water, anti-aircraft fire turning the sky into a deadly storm. And yet through it all, the Enterprise endured. Perhaps the most iconic moment came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Enterprise's planes decimated Japanese aircraft in waves that left entire squadrons destroyed before they could even reach the fleet. Her deck launched attack after attack, her anti-aircraft gunners firing relentlessly, each shot a testament to skill, coordination, and a refusal to yield. The Japanese Navy had hoped to regain momentum in the Pacific, but against the Enterprise, they were met with overwhelming force and precision that seemed almost preternatural. Every victory left scars, and the Enterprise was far from unscathed. Fires, bomb strikes, and kamikaze attempts marked her hull, yet the same fires that should have destroyed her became symbols of survival. Every repaired deck plate, every replaced gun,
Every patched hull section told the story of a ship that refused to die. Sailors spoke of her as if she were a living being, a guardian that protected them even as they risked their lives on her decks. By mid-1944, the Enterprise had earned a place in history. She had participated in nearly every major Pacific engagement, her planes instrumental in turning the tide against Japan. Admirals, pilots, and Marines all understood her significance. She was more than a ship. She was a symbol of American ingenuity, courage, and perseverance. She had avenged Pearl Harbor not with one strike, but with countless missions that gradually crushed the Japanese Navy's offensive capabilities. The end of 1944 saw the Enterprise heading home for repairs once more. She returned to port, battered but triumphant. The men who had served aboard her disembarked, many carrying medals, others carrying memories too heavy to share. Families waited, unaware of the countless near-death experiences endured just to keep their loved ones alive. Historians would later recount her deeds as pivotal, her impact immeasurable. Though the war continued and new carriers joined the fight, the legend of the Enterprise endured. She had faced destruction and survived, struck back against impossible odds, and become the embodiment of America's resolve in the Pacific. Pilots she launched would go on to countless missions. Marines she protected would continue to fight. And the Navy she represented would carry forward the legacy of courage she inspired. In the quiet moments after each mission, as sailors scrubbed decks, tended the wounded, or gazed across the endless horizon, there was an unspoken truth. The Enterprise had become the spirit of American resilience. She was not just a ship, but a promise that the United States would fight back, that the Pearl Harbor attack would not go unanswered, and that no enemy, no matter how formidable, could ever extinguish the fire of determination aboard her decks. Her story became legend, her name whispered with reverence, and her deeds etched permanently into the history of naval warfare. USS Enterprise, the carrier that avenged Pearl Harbor, had proven that courage, skill, and unbreakable resolve could turn a single ship into a force capable of changing the course of a war. And for every sailor, pilot, and Marine who set foot on her decks, she would always be more than metal and steel. She would always be the ghost that haunted the enemy, the protector that carried America's hope across the vast Pacific, and the most dangerous ship the world had ever known.